Welcome back to another edition of Recruiter Fuel. You know, in these sessions, we generally talk with recruiters about recruiting, not about what happens after you actually do the recruiting. So with me for this session, I have Scott Wilson again with me. Scott, thanks for joining.
Glad to be here.
So you're a principal consultant with our executive search business.
Correct.
Okay. So let's talk about this, what happens after the hire. And the reason I bring this up, there's a book that I refer to often. It's Mark Murphy's book. It's Hiring for Attitude.
Okay.
And I don't buy into everything, but there's some statistics in it that I think we've got to look at, that anybody who's in recruiting, any hiring leader is saying, yes, that makes sense. And what he came down to is he said 11% of the time when we fire somebody, we fire them for skill. 89% of the time, we fire for something completely different, generally something behavior competency related. Why do you think that is?
I think it's a good question. I think it ties most directly to the fact that hiring managers, interviewers, when they are interviewing candidates, regardless of role, they're focusing on kind of the knowledge, skills, and abilities that they feel.
KSAs.
KSAs that someone somewhere put on a job description a long time ago and said, this is what we need to hire to. And they're not taking enough into account the pieces of the candidate outside of the KSAs. For example, you know, the kind of what's in their head and what's in their heart. You know, they're focusing a bit too much on the knowledge, skills, and abilities itself.
Okay, so wait a minute. You're saying that a human being is more than just knowledge, skills, and abilities?
Yeah. Contrary to what I was taught many years ago in starting out in recruiting, where it really was about 5 years of this and 3 years of that, and can they speak this language, and there's a lot more to it than that now.
So all those things, can they speak this language, 5 years, those are all back to knowledge, skills, and abilities.
Right.
But more and more and more, people talk about competencies in their job descriptions. Is it getting any better?
No, because you can come up with a list. You can go to an organization like Lominger and come up with a list of competencies for a job, and you can handpick a few off the list and say, this sounds like something that we'd like or something that works for our organization. But what you're not doing is you're not asking the right questions around those competencies. You're not asking for situational or results-based questions of these candidates. So you're really making assumptions if they fit some of those competencies.
Okay, I've had this happen. Tell me if you've had this happen, where I have a hiring leader and an HR executive sit down together and they create a job description.
Right.
And they're making assumptions about, to your point, they need this skill to do the job and this skill to do the job. Yet when I ask them to compare that job description to the person most successful in that job, they don't have any of those skills anyways.
Not surprisingly not uncommon. And I think that comes down to the fact that, number one, you have to always make sure there's not a disconnect between what HR is saying you need for a role and what the hiring leader is saying that you need for a role.
How does that, wait a minute, the job description is a job description, Scott, whether it's for this hiring manager or that hiring manager, it's a job description for the same role.
But we know there's so many canned job descriptions out there that, how long ago was that job description refreshed? Who was involved in refreshing it? I mean, if you're hiring with the same JD that you were 10 years ago, that's going to create a big problem for your organization.
Well, I think it even goes beyond that, to what I was just saying. So if you and I are hiring for the exact same position, and we're using the same job description, the exact same one, my expectations of that person and your expectations of that person, and I'm not talking about, if it's a sales job, that it's a different in revenue expectation, but it could be different in how they communicate. It could be different in how they go about doing their job. The expectations are very different, which is not reflective on a job description, right?
True. We had an issue recently with one of the clients where they were looking for a certain set of competencies and they were assessing for those competencies. And I had to ask the question to the hiring manager, have you taken these assessments? Meaning, how well do you align
you fit the competencies
to what you're saying you need for this role since you're managing this role? And he laughed because he reluctantly admitted he'd never taken them. So, I do think that you're always going to have, there's always going to be a bit of a gray area when it comes to, are 2 or 3 people involved in the hiring process all looking for exactly the same thing? But that's where you have to meet in advance and ahead of time and say, okay, what are we truly looking for in this role? What are we truly looking for in this person? And then start crafting your interview questions based on more than just the knowledge, the skills, and the ability.
Well, you said something earlier, and I think this is important I don't care if you've been recruiting for 20 years or if you've been recruiting for 20 hours, it makes no difference. What we've got to understand about people is we're more than just the sum total of our knowledge, skills, and abilities. You mentioned three things. You mentioned knowledge, skills, and abilities, and I'm going to lump that into one. Okay. You mentioned head, and you mentioned heart. So do they have the skills, assuming that they need those skills, number one? Do they have the heart and the passion to actually do the job, which is number two? And the whole number three piece, when you think about head, it's do they do the job the way you want them to do it, which is what the difference is from hiring manager to hiring manager. So if I heard you correctly, and I know I'm summarizing this for you, Scott, so jump in here, but human beings are really all three. And if we're hiring just off of knowledge, skills, and abilities, we're basically interviewing guys for 1/3 of a human being.
That's absolutely correct. And any of us who have been recruiting long enough have heard that statement of we hire for skill and we fire for personality.
It's really behavior more than personality.
But where's the miss? You know, when you go back and I know I do it when I have intake calls, I'm asking, you know, tell me about the last person that was in the role. What about the person before that? You know, we always talk about candidates and how when you're screening or interviewing candidates, you're trying to see if there's any pattern of behavior relative to why they've left companies or been let go from companies. We need to do the same thing with hiring leaders and why, you know, especially if it's one who's changed out staff a lot over the last couple of years. Why is that? Because then you're getting it kind of, as you said, the deeper root of it's more than just, you know, their briefcase. It's about everything else.
Yeah, we can't rely, and the numbers show. Again, if we're firing 11% of the time only for what's in their briefcase or knowledge, skills, and abilities, and we're firing 89% of the time for the other stuff, it generally means we're not recruiting for the other stuff, we're not screening for the other stuff, we're not interviewing for the other stuff. So literally, our odds are that we're going to be wrong because we're hiring for 1/3 of the individual. I think it's time we start hiring for 3/3.
I think,
I just made that up, by the way.
100%. It's 3/3, so I would agree.
So I'm going to have you back on because I want to drill in a little bit deeper. You and I have had this conversation about the 4 specific areas to focus on around behaviors of an individual and why those dictate how they're going to potentially perform. We'll get to that at the next session.
Sounds good.
Guys, this has been another edition of Recruiter Feel. You know, I hope you're spending the time to really think about some of these things. If you've been in recruiting for whether it's 20 hours or 20 years, you're probably making the same issues or creating the same issues of hiring 1/3 of a body. It's now time to start hiring the whole individual. We'll see you guys in a week.